In 2023, a sword was auctioned at Christie's in London. It sold for over $17 million. Not because it was covered in jewels, not because it belonged to a king who ruled half the world. It sold because of what it was made of. The blade once belonged to Tipu Sultan, one of the few rulers who seriously challenged British expansion in India. When his fortress fell in 1799, British soldiers didn't just seize his weapons, they fought over them. Not for decoration, for the steel, because even after they had defeated the man, they couldn't figure out how that steel had been made. That question, first asked in a captured armory, would take nearly 200 years to begin answering. Not because the scientists who tried were incompetent, because the answer required instruments that hadn't been invented yet, and questions that no one knew how to ask. This is the story of Wootz steel, one of the most remarkable materials ever made. A material developed in ancient India that traveled across continents, shaped warfare, and challenged some of the greatest scientific minds in history. Look closely at the surface of this blade, that flowing pattern, like water frozen in metal. It's not decoration, it's structure. If you pressed your thumb against the flat of the blade, you'd feel something unusual. The metal gives slightly, then springs back, hard, yet resilient. That combination is difficult to achieve. For most of history, blacksmiths faced a compromise. Make steel hard, and it becomes brittle. Make it flexible, and it loses its edge. Wootz steel did both. And it originated in southern India, in regions like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, where this process had been refined for centuries. The steel itself was called uku. When European traders encountered it, they wrote the word phonetically. It became Wootz. Inside, the carbon content was unusually high, often between 1 and 2%. But the real difference wasn't just the amount of carbon, it was how that carbon was arranged within the metal, and that's where the story becomes harder to explain. Wootz didn't stay in India. It moved through Indian Ocean trade networks into Persia, Arabia, and the wider Islamic world. There, master smiths forged it into blades. That became known as Damascus Steel. When these blades were etched with mild acid, their internal structure revealed itself as flowing bands across the surface. The same pattern you saw at the beginning, not decorative, functional. Warriors learned to recognize it because that pattern meant something about how the blade would behave. The 12th century geographer Al-Idrisi noted that Indian steel had no equal. This wasn't exaggeration, it was observation. These blades were valuable, sometimes compared in worth to livestock, or exchanged as diplomatic gifts. They were named, preserved, passed down, and their influence may have reached even further. The famous Ulfbert swords, found across northern Europe, contain unusually pure steel for their time. Some researchers suggest this may have been imported Crucible steel, possibly linked to Indian production through long-distance trade routes. If that connection holds, Indian steel may have traveled thousands of miles, shaped into Scandinavian blades, and used in combat far from where it was made. A material shaping warfare, not just across Asia, but potentially across the Viking world too. The process behind Wootz steel is known as crucible steel making. Iron, sometimes in the form of magnetite ore, was placed inside small clay crucibles, along with carbon-rich materials, charcoal, wood, sometimes plant matter from specific species. The crucible was sealed, then placed inside a furnace, heated to temperatures between 1,300 and 1,400 degrees Celsius, and held there for hours, sometimes longer. In certain regions, furnaces weren't powered by bellows at all. Archaeologist Gil Juleff documented sites designed to face seasonal monsoon winds using natural airflow to intensify combustion, a system that turned climate into infrastructure. After heating, the crucibles were removed and left to cool slowly. That step was critical because as the metal cooled, its internal structure began to organize. Think of it like baking. Temperature and timing mattered more than force. Inside the solidifying metal, carbon began forming patterns. invisible at first, but when the ingot was later forged and etched, those internal structures surfaced as the flowing pattern on the blade. The same pattern you saw at the beginning. The craftsmen didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the process, and for centuries, that was enough. If you've never heard this story before, that's not an accident. It's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to Historified, because the most important history is often the part that gets left out. By the early 1800s, the original method had largely faded, and scientists began trying to recreate it. Among them was Michael Faraday, one of the most influential experimental scientists in history. He worked with master cutler James Stoddart to analyze and reproduce Wootz steel. They examined samples, melted them down, attempted to rebuild them, and reached the wrong conclusion. They believed the secret lay in impurities, like silica and aluminium oxide. They published their findings, and for a time they were accepted, but they were wrong. This wasn't a minor mistake. It shows just how difficult this problem really was. Across Europe, other scientists continued experimenting. Different metals, different temperatures, different techniques. But the results remained the same. The patterns wouldn't form. The properties didn't match. For nearly 2 centuries, no one could fully explain what ancient craftsmen had achieved. In the late 20th century, metallurgist John Verhoeven revisited the problem, this time with modern analytical tools. After years of experimentation, he identified something earlier researchers had overlooked: trace elements. And after all of that, the answer turned out to be almost invisible. In one case, iron containing about 0.04% vanadium, just 40 parts per million, produced the characteristic pattern. A tiny amount, almost undetectable, without modern equipment, but enough to influence how the metal formed as it cooled. These trace elements guided carbon into specific regions, hard for edge retention, soft for flexibility. Not a single secret, but a precise balance of materials, temperature, and timing. And all of it came down to something almost invisible. In 2006, researchers studying a historical Damascus blade reported structures consistent with carbon nanotubes inside the steel. Extremely small, exceptionally strong. The kind of structures used today in advanced materials science. But this finding remains debated. Some scientists suggest these structures may have formed during the analysis process itself. Others believe they reflect something inherent to the original forging. What's clear is this: Wootz steel contained complexities that took modern science centuries to begin understanding. Wootz didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the world changed. In the 18th century, Benjamin Huntsman developed a new steel-making process. It wasn't as specialized, but it was consistent, scalable, affordable. At the same time, access to specific ores containing the right trace elements declined, and as firearms replaced swords, demand for high-end blade steel collapsed. Within a few generations, the knowledge faded. Think back to that auction room in 2023. $17 million for one blade. The people in that room weren't paying for the jewels on the hilt. They weren't just paying for Tipu Sultan's name, they were paying for the metal itself. Because somewhere, even without fully knowing why, they understood what science eventually confirmed. This is a material the world has struggled to fully reproduce in its original form. For centuries, craftsmen in India created something that traveled across continents and challenged what people thought was possible. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't have modern chemistry, but they had something just as powerful: time, precision, and continuity across generations. It took centuries to build and far less time to lose. We called that primitive. We were wrong. If this changed how you see history, that's the point. Like the video, share it with someone who still thinks ancient civilizations were simple, and subscribe to Historified, because the past isn't behind us. It's still shaping everything we think we understand.